Martin, welcome to the show.
So good to be here, Cody. Finally make it.
I'm so thrilled to have you on here. You and I have gotten to know each other, I guess, virtually now for many years, though we haven't, even though we both live in LA, Los Angeles, we've never met in person.
Yeah.
But, I had you, back when I was at Techstars, had you come and present to a large audience at Techstars all about carbon accounting, and just had such glowing reviews of your remarks because you think about it from such a different perspective than most people do. That you've been someone long on my list to bring on the show. So I'm glad we're finally making it happen.
It's an honor to be here. Yeah.
Well, why don't we start before we dive into Open Earth and carbon accounting and all the topics I know we're going to dive into. Let's hear about you. How did this become an area that you wanted to focus on? And by this, I mean climate and collaboration globally around understanding what's happening to our Earth.
Yeah, and obviously inspired by the title, right? What is my climate journey and how it might resonate with others? And for me, it's been a lifelong process. I was born in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and right after high school, there was all kinds of things that I wanted to do, but I moved to the US because college allowed large flexibility of things. And I took a class that changed my life that was astrobiology. And astrobiology helped me see the planet as a 4.5 billion year organism, as a living organism. And two things that mark me till this day, that looking at things from these large cycles is so important, and it gets you to see such a different perspective of it took 3.5 billion years to have the oxygen levels that we have today and the CO2 levels that we have today. And so it also highlights how fast in the last 60 years things have changed. And to me, that was shocking. And the other thing is the scales from micro to macro. So a big part of astrobiology, looking at life in other planets, is about microbiology, right? Small bacteria that can seed a planet, and microbes in this planet affected the entire chemistry. So without knowing, that was my entry point into systems thinking from a holistic standpoint, and to Earth as a living organism. So for me, the entry into climate was sitting in this class and realizing, doing some back of the envelope calculations and saying, oh my God, it is our generation that is having to face reversing this deep trend towards eroding billions of years of pristine environment in a short time period. And I said to myself, this is a fascinating time to be alive in the history of this planet, and I want to be part of it. So that got me into, okay, what are some renewable energies things that I can do from the biology space? And then that took me into microbial fuel cells. And then suddenly I was in a lab looking at how microbes could produce electricity, clean energy, and clean water. But it wasn't sort of scalable, that I got more and more into it. And I realized, well, the problem here is not technological. It doesn't seem to be economical, because what's the cost of destroying the planet is way more than like the mobilizing capital to fix it. And without having any strong vision of political economy, I came up with my own explanation of a social enterprise. And so we decided to go back to Argentina to start my first social enterprise, and discovered myself in some sense as an entrepreneur. And for around 6 years, so that was the first kind of changing point for me, was that astrobiological perspective. The second, in some sense, was, social enterprises can be a very important way for me to express my interest in the topic. And in Argentina, there was all kinds of things that I started doing, from measuring carbon footprint of companies back in 2007, and then using some profits of that to put into deploying solar kitchens in the border between Argentina and Bolivia, or working on forest conservation in the border with Brazil. But at the same time, I realized that I was always thinking about big ideas that were too ambitious for what the reality of consulting or a small startup in Argentina. And then that was the second, I think, pivotal point where I decided to do a PhD and think about how to innovate the business space and the climate space together. I moved to Australia, and I focused on the transformation of the global energy business system. we often think about oil and gas companies as like the usual suspects, right? What we're facing is the fact that they have to cannibalize their core business model, radically change that. And so I went deep into what that entails, and also about how innovative projects could change the paradigm of the energy business. And so I focused on peer-to-peer smart grids and new business models for that. So the long story short is that got me into the digital space. As you know, a lot of my work today is on open digital systems, but it really started by thinking about what is something in the innovation space that could change radically. And the peer-to-peer space took me into Web3. And Web3, at that time, it was very apparent out of my PhD that I was a little bit too much of an entrepreneur to be a traditional academic, and too much of a sort of big picture thinker to be a mainstream entrepreneur. So I moved back to the US, and I was fortunate enough to be able to set up the Open Innovation Lab at Yale University and the solar energy project at the MIT Media Lab's Digital Currency Initiative. And that's how I got into carbon accounting, because I had a lot of colleagues throughout my PhD period that were looking at the carbon budget and measuring the carbon budget. So the remaining physical space in our atmosphere where after you put so much greenhouse gases, you cross the tipping point for 1.5 degrees. And then looking at blockchain as an accounting system. And so it was like, well, the ultimate ledger that we have is the atmosphere. How are we going to manage this atmospheric accounting in this sort of ticking clock of the budget? And so out of Yale, we presented a lot of these ideas at COP25 in Madrid. And then I learned that the UN climate change had a lot of gaps in their not just emerging tech, but just digitization and managing the Paris Agreement. And that in 2020 is how I decided to launch OpenEarth.
Amazing. Thank you for walking us through, sort of how these disparate experiences, brought you to where you are today. And so you went through all of these experiences, and you have now built and are running the OpenEarth Foundation. What is the OpenEarth Foundation?
Part of the model that I was, in some sense, researching while I was at the Yale Open Lab was, how do we use like big picture system thinking, particularly Earth systems analysis, to programmatically come up with entrepreneurial projects that are designed to hit leverage points. And I know that sounds a little bit esoteric, but it's sort of like in my own explanation of what are some critical projects that are not decided by what are market opportunities, but an action that can have a huge impact. And so I often describe that we look for those in the intersection of emerging technologies, because I feel that they can bring in capabilities that obviously augment humans' capabilities to deal with such a large system like planet Earth. But then the other part is open source and the role of open digital infrastructure, open standards, open protocols, and more than anything, the collaboration needed to create that. And then all of those two aspects to Earth system thinking.
I'm gonna, even just note there that I think a good example from you that I take away from what you just said was how you think about blockchain and Web3, which is to say we're obviously living in a time in 2023 when the broader blockchain space, I think, is navigating the corruptive nature of capitalism in many cases to take something and encourage actors to exploit it for capitalistic purposes to as to the end of the end of days as much as possible, sadly. And yet I feel like from the beginning, every conversation I've had with you about blockchain is less around, there's this great business idea I have, or like, I know how we're going to make all this money selling tokens. It has nothing to do with that. And it's more thinking about it as kind of the next evolution of open source and of, sort of almost common good collaboration from a technology perspective. Is that the right way for me to think about how you're thinking about leveraging technology generally, regardless of blockchain?
Yeah, absolutely. And a mechanism where we agree on a core source of truth or of state. What's the state of the planet? What's the state of the atmosphere? What's the health of nature? What's the status of that? and how do we build systems that are designed to maintain that, to augment that. And so records can help, and records that don't require a level of trust, but also, again, how sensors and AI and models all play a role in trying to attest to that is critical, which is, whilst we started looking at the carbon budget, immediately it started into monitoring, reporting, and verification systems in the market spaces, and more just as a common record keeping system. The reality, of course, is back in the day was, okay, let's address double counting, but blockchains don't address double counting only if the whole system is within one blockchain. But not when you have 50 blockchains.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is OpenEarth Foundation essentially exists to leverage technology, leveraging technology as a public good to solve large-scale collaboration problems,
Yes.
particularly as it relates to the Earth and to climate change.
Yes, and hopefully also leveraging collaboration so that technology can play a role in scaling broader collaboration, because it does require certain levels of collaboration to create those systems. And I'm inspired by the phrase from Buckminster Fuller on the operating system for Spaceship Earth, or operating manual for Spaceship Earth. So for me, one of the missions of OpenEarth is like, how do we design the operating system? So the digital mesh that helps us manage something that's greater than all of us. But in the process of doing so, and this is maybe a holistic view to that, that it helps us realize that which we're managing is also what we are. So a big part of the division that we have as a core issue in our environmental problems is this illusion that we're separated from nature, that we're separate from Earth. And so we have to save Earth or help Earth and realize that we are Earth and we're part of it. So how does that also play in how we design the systems from that mindset?
From a theory of change perspective, what incentives are there for people to leverage technology for the common good? A cynical capitalist may say people are just going to leverage technologies for their own exploitative practices. How are you seeing that not be true?
I mean, I think one key example is the internet is the best example of a digital public good we have. It's not totally neutral, and it's not totally decentralized, and it's in some sense been co-opted by a lot of private interest. But it's a networking layer that helps transact value and information and things like that. So we kind of need the Earth internet, or make the internet help us manage Earth in a good way. So when we think about a climate accounting system, we think about like a climate internet, where just like in the internet, you search for something and it will hit any public website that's using HTML and will retrieve information, and all of that will happen in seconds. So if we are to say, I want to know of all the climate mitigation projects within 100 miles of where I'm at today, we don't have a protocol for that, because obviously you can't pull it from one database. Otherwise, it would just be a very simple query. And so those are some of the things that we think about, like protocols and standards that could help a lot of the climate information talk to each other, and discoverability. And then the other part, which for me, Web3 was interesting, is power automation. So the first sort of thought experiment, and it's interesting because we're a little bit closer to doing that, is, a big discussion in the policy space is carbon pricing. But carbon pricing is often derived using the social cost of carbon, and there's some subjective roles around that. And none of those models look at the remaining carbon budget. At the moment, our remaining carbon budget is around 260 gigatons, and we put out 50 gigatons a year. So it doesn't take much to think about within the next 6-7 years, we could irreversibly cross our 1.5 degrees. That equation needs to be part of how we price carbon. Our emissions different, and I must always clarify how we price a carbon credit. There's different equations that go into how we price a carbon credit. How we price our emissions, our liability, and our impact. And so for that, you kind of have to have sources of truth to say, well, here's the remaining carbon budget, and here's how we're going to price it, and here's how For example, a government, or in our model, we could perfectly see an Earth taxation system where you pay carbon price to Earth. So it goes to a fund, and from there it trickles into projects that have the right quality to do it. So rather than lobbying for your government to roll out carbon price, you can just say, we'll do that with Earth.
So let's dive into that carbon accounting, because obviously in order to, understand what our annual sort of gigaton output is as a society today, that presumes some degree of accurate accounting on a carbon level. But I don't know where that begins. Does that begin at the nation state level? Does that begin at an individual corporation? From what I know, corporations, who are the ones outputting the bulk of these emissions, most of them have no idea what their carbon footprint is today. They maybe are starting to get their arms around, their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, meaning the emissions of their operations and the emissions of their own power use, though many of them don't. Feels like almost none of them have their arms around their own scope 3 emissions, which is the emissions of their supply chain. But that's just at an individual corporate level, and that spans global geographies. So when we talk about the amount of gigaton output happening on Earth per year, is that a roll-up of nation-state level emissions? Is that a roll-up of corporate level emissions? And where in the world does that data actually come from today?
Great point, and so timely, because we're in 2023, and this is the first year where the Paris Agreement is conducting its first global stocktake. That will happen in COP28 in Dubai this year. And that's sort of the exercise where we have to come together and say, what did you say you were going to do? What did you do? And now what should you do? Right? A massive accountability exercise. So for me, the way that I describe where this starts in the high level policy, the Paris Agreement, the UN climate change requires countries to submit their greenhouse gas inventories. And they follow a methodology through IPCC. Normally happens through sectorial data aggregation. Energy sector, what are your emissions? Agricultural sector, what are your emissions? And residential sector, et cetera, and so forth. And those are put together, and out of those, we calculate roughly what are those total emissions. So we spent a lot of time trying to think about alternative complementary ways of doing that. And then at the same time, how do you cross-reference those same numbers by just looking at and what are the traces that we see in the atmosphere? So using more direct measurement. It's very hard because you also have to factor in all the natural carbon cycle. But we hope that more and more we would be able to advance to actually do a double entry bookkeeping system. This is what the world is saying, and this is what we actually see. But that's one way. The way that we've been focusing a lot and actually got a lot of progress in the last couple of years is what we talk about nested climate accounting. And it's because if you look at those sectors, energy or agriculture, the creation of policies, it derives a lot of insight, but to create policies for the energy sector, you have a ministerial department, but it might not necessarily go directly to the organizations. Nested accounting starts by the site and the building and who owns the building or owns that site. Okay, an organization, that organization sits within the purview of a municipality, which is inside a city, which is inside a subnational government, which is inside different levels of subnational governments inside a national government, inside Earth. So if we're able to do things by spatially aligning and understanding that nested jurisdiction, whoever you are, wherever you are, you end up in that sort of stock taking exercise. And we've pushed that forward enough that it's now been incorporated as an architecture to consider for what's called Article 6.4, which is more around how do you deal with markets as credits move from one place to the other, by being able to say, if you are buying voluntary carbon credits in Brazil, well, technically that should roll up to the Brazilian greenhouse gas inventory and the progress towards their nationally determined contribution. If you want to use them in where your emissions happen, let's say in California, well, Brazil and the United States would have to agree that something is negative here and something's positive there, or the other way around. And so that requires that level of let's say, geotagging.
So the challenge I'm hearing is less, understanding what the total output is, and it's more about managing at a level below or two levels below that how the horse trading happens, right? Like who's taking responsibility for what, in order to create accountability. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, and a way to connect, like, even though you mentioned like a lot of corporations don't know what their carbon footprint is, but there's a lot of movement in that. And we've seen in the last couple of years so many new startups that are working on greenhouse gas accountancy, and they provide the company with a number, and maybe there's not a lot, but will allow a audit firm to come in and stamp it, which they used to do that before already. But where does that end up, right? So, well, they could maybe use it for the ESG reports, and now we're going to have more regulatory requirements. But how do we trace that into the greenhouse gas inventory that plays under the Paris Agreement? And that's one of the big things that we focus on. And then, of course, the third method, which is nascent now, but we think very powerful in the future, is through satellite and machine learning models and integrative assessment models, so that you could, by what you observe, determine this is what your emissions are. And we work closely with an organization called Climate Trace that works closely on that. And these are all complementary. We need to be able to have a level of redundancy, because the more insight we have on this, the better policy and finance can track that. A good example, and large banks sort of often pose this problem to us. If I am lending a country $1 billion for climate action, how do I follow the dollar into the greenhouse gas inventory that gets reported to the Secretariat? It's not that easy. And so we think about what would it take to do that. And of course, all of that needs to be open architecture, run through open standards, and public and neutral. And that's why we're a 501c3.
And let's talk about what that looks like in terms of how you do that. You mentioned earlier on one of the challenges with, yes, blockchain helps with double counting, but that's only if everybody's on the same blockchain. So I would presume then OpenEarth is not trying to say, hey, everyone in the world, like, you use this one tech stack, because that doesn't seem like that would work.
Right.
But instead, you're having to basically build some big integration layer, like data input and integration layer, or is it like, I don't know, I'm making stuff up now. What is it? What does it look like?
Well, that's part of the challenge, right? Right now, we in last COP published Openclimate.network. It's a nested accounting system, so you can navigate through information that often is disparate, like country information and subnational government, and it's connected with a federated data commons, so that's just one database, and it's connected to other databases, and you can pull information from different sources. I think the next challenge for us is going more at the protocol level, where all these things would combine. And obviously, one of the challenges that we have as a nonprofit is, as soon as you go very deep into the technical architecture, it requires mobilizing a lot of bandwidth, a lot of capital, and a lot of talent into these major challenges. You see that a lot of the startups in this space that are well endowed are focusing on their product, but not on some of these underlying protocols. Some countries don't understand the importance of this. So we're always in the challenge of driving little projects as possible to seeing what that would look like, and opportunities where we can advance on that. There's some low-hanging fruits that we're currently working on that are very helpful for the process of the global stocktake. For example, the way that countries actually submit their progress reports to their NDCs, their nationally determined contribution, is through PDFs, and they just sit in the Secretariat in the UN climate change cloud. So now there's 500 documents sitting there, but you can't search like what are the best practices in terms of climate action or climate adaptation in West Africa, and that it would pull and read from those documents. So those are just some pretty standard digital tools that we can leverage, and that we're working with the Secretariat on helping that, so that already the information that's been submitted in PDFs is better accessible to the public, better accessible for insights to policy. So that's one aspect that eventually Open Climate can then pull in, bring insights, and work closely with UN to provide better clarity for better policy, better financial mechanisms, and ultimately a lot of digital infrastructure standard working groups that we're part of. W3C, ISOs, and we have a climate action data 2.0 community where we discuss some of these things. And we often see that we need, there's no way to have one standard to rule them all, and or a data model. So you kind of have to have resolvers, like something that says, oh, well, you presented in this format, that's equivalent to this other format, and here's how you translate it. And so those are like digital public engines that are running and solving for these things, taxonomies, solving for taxonomies and things like that.
So what I'm hearing is, what most of the dialogue around blockchain and climate, it centers around the carbon markets and centers around actually moving carbon credits on chain to be transacted, to actually manage the offsets themselves in some way, shape, or form through a digital mechanism. I'm hearing from you, that's fine. That can all happen. But the layer that isn't being built, or that we're the ones helping to define at OpenEarth Foundation, is really the record keeping layer of just and a transparent view into what's happening broadly across all of this, regardless of whether the transactions themselves are being managed on the blockchain or not. Is that a correct way to think about it?
Yeah, and one way that we also frame it, building from that, is there's three sectors that need to be integrated for a better stock taking process. One is, of course, the national and subnational level, and we've aggregated a lot of the data for that. The other one is the corporate sector you mentioned, very important, as every almost like ERP or cloud provider is coming with their own carbon accounting, plus the startups, plus the regulatory environment moving forward. And then the third is the climate market. So national, subnational, corporate, and then markets. And then most of what we know in the refi or DeFi meets Web3, or DeFi meets carbon, is a subsection of that climate market space. But there's a lot of opportunities. Like we are launching, we announced in Davos and launching, I think in April, a carbon pricing oracle. So we tell you the result of integrative assessment models that calculate the social cost of carbon, and you can determine your discount rate, because there are subjectivities to it. And you could take that as an oracle and input it into a smart contract. So you could say, well, one thing I can do is buy my voluntary carbon credits out of Vera or directly from Pachama or whoever it is, your provider or region. Or you could say, this is the impact of my emissions, and my carbon pricing says this, and dynamically it will already execute that contract, for example. So we try to do little innovations in those three sectors. In the corporate side, around bringing the corporate carbon footprint calculators to have a common reporting or common integration layer. And then, of course, with the national subnational, is helping in that intersection between countries and the secretariat.
How much of on that last piece, the national and subnational level, how much of it is just purely helping the UN modernize itself to being a digital friendly data organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of our quests, and I often describe OpenEarth as a bridge organization between the tech space broadly and the supranational. So we collaborate very closely with the World Bank on their climate market infrastructure, and we're a partner of UN climate change. From where our vantage point, you see amazing gaps where obviously UN agencies don't have like a full team of IT with cutting edge capabilities that are constantly upgrading the systems. The countries that are supporting the UN are often hesitant to fund technology. They often partner with tech companies, but they send a lot of marketing people, so not their solution architects. And traditional climate NGOs also happen to not have in-house engineering teams, and philanthropies also not their strength. So we found that gap, and we're like, wow, we need to do something different. We need to be a climate NGO that has a full tech team. So we've got like a full engineering team, and we're just going in and trying to fix bugs, put pipes together, and be a bit of like digital plumbers, where that happens by knowing how to collaborate in a very non-threatening and neutral way, and fundamentally explaining like out of COP, we came up with an idea of helping philanthropies increase their capability of digital literacy and how important funding open digital infrastructure is, because they often tend to think, well, the big tech firms should fund that. Well, they often don't, because there's also a gap for them, and they don't want to necessarily directly fund an open layer where their competitors also might have a benefit, even though the reality is they all benefit from that. So yeah, I think that's been a bit of a role, and when we started, it was really hard to try to get this supported, because when we lead with blockchain and AI, you can imagine that a lot of the traditional funders of climate NGOs think we're speaking gibberish. And it's hard for them to sort of take risks on something that's very emerging. And funding digital modernization for the UN is also something that philanthropies would say the government should fund that, and the government say the philanthropy should fund that. And so then the UN is like, well, someone's got to fund this.
I'm going to come back to how you got funded, because you have an amazing story there. But before we do that, one other question just on collaborating with big organizations like the UN. In the smaller corner of the carbon markets, we've seen Vera, for example, recently actually issue a request for basically an RFP, a request for proposal of how they should think about digitizing, that I know, folks like Toucan and Flow Carbon and others have replied to and are kind of giving them guidance on how to think about that. To me, that feels like a matter of when, not if, it's going to happen. It's just going to take some time to work through the details. For the UN, are they issuing RFPs? Like, how are you in there helping them figure out what they should spend their time on and where, as an example?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I mean, the Web3 space has also, it's a really nice community. There's levels of fragmentation, as there is everywhere, but I was participating in a lot of these consultation rounds that then led up to a newly launched blockchain climate leadership network, where a lot of these participants, and Vera has been open to feedback and where they should go. So it's been really nice to see that dynamic dialogue happen. Of course, we know a lot of the issues with the Guardian article and going back and forth, but it goes to show the importance of what we talk about. Is we think about the importance of integrity and MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification of the climate markets, but we have to think about MRV broadly than markets. So how do you MRV your greenhouse gas inventory and so many other things? And so we think about national or international MRV systems. Back to the UN, they don't directly do that, unless that I'm aware, unless there's a specific funder involved that's supporting them in the program. And the recent activity of that is in the mid last year, in lead up to what are called the intersessionals to the COP, Bloomberg and Macron announced a project towards what France called the Open Planet Data Hub. And that created the Climate Data Steering Committee. The Climate Data Steering Committee just issued an RFP for building the net zero data public utility that would eventually integrate with the Global Climate Action Portal of UNFCCC. That's a mouthful, but that just shows also the institutional cascades that need to happen for that. At OpenEarth, we happen to be very active. This is taking a lot of my time, but it's really a lot of the role that we have of convening open source community and open source efforts for responding to that RFP, including the for-profit companies that to participate, to ensure that we bring a lot of the thought leadership and knowledge that we have around this on responding to these RFPs that talk about an international data public utility for net zero, but that could play a role in UN climate change. I think that's one example where this happens. I would love to see more. I think they're not probably as used to dealing with also the responses that they might have. One thing is for Vera to issue an RFP, but think about UN Environment Program, they're issuing an RFP, and suddenly they just have a lot of submissions, and they don't have the bandwidth to deal with the responses, let alone what happens afterwards. So I think that they have to they have to figure out how to manage that. So unless it's this very specific funded program for a specific thing, we don't see that level of process. But what we have seen, and we're part of that, is how UN can modernize their system, not from inside, but by partnering with consortium networks. So that's one of the things that, for example, the UN Climate Global Innovation Hub that we're involved with, how do you set up, this is a three-sided marketplace helping cities meet their core human needs by matching them with innovators and finance, a very innovative thought for the UN, which the most important thing is that as long as they have political support for driving these modern platforms, that's kind of like all you need. Then like partners like us and others can help them think about how to set that up, set up a consortium that has an agreement with the UN and can bring in funding from outside and can fund a tech team that's working on that so that you don't have to put, full stack engineers sitting in Bonn, Germany, under the UN to focus on that, right? So there's ways in which the innovation and the partnership of UN systems will help drive the modernization of their digital platforms.
I think the amount of consensus building that you're kind of highlighting is for many of us, myself included, who tend to come from the entrepreneurial space. It's just it's a very different and interesting skill set, and so important in terms of that playing that role across so many of those actors. Helping to steward in what order should things be tackled, in what priorities should things be tackled, in what direction should things be tackled, to ultimately help us all as a society be better at managing these trade-offs that you mentioned are being made. So thanks for sharing all that. It really, at least for me, is very illuminating on the unique role that an organization like OpenEarth plays in the kind of dance of global actors.
Well, thanks. And actually that's one of the things that we're figuring out, how to convey better and easier what we do, because it can be a little bit esoteric and very niche specific. So as a 501(c)(3), if you click donate, like, what are you donating for? And I think ultimately collaboration requires like digital public good support or public good support, and that's often what we do, right? Collaboration, but from a subject matter expertise standpoint and the ability to do things.
Well, let's talk about funding. So, as I understand it, you all were able to secure quite a good deal of funding, in sort of the heyday of the NFT and sort of Web3 boom over the last few years. You all took on some incredibly innovative ways of leveraging the interest in NFTs to fund your organization. I'm guessing that is not quite as available to you in 2023 as it was in 2021, but maybe share a bit about what you did in the past, and then how you're thinking about continuing to fund your operations going forward.
Yeah, great. And that was one of the first challenges setting up OpenEarth, is how to fund it, and having a first chat with philanthropies and seeing that it was a little bit harder to convey our message. Even one technically disruptive family office that we came up with a project and they say, this is too innovative. And I'm like, oh my God, I thought you're supposed to be risk capital. And we were fortunate enough, one of our early supporters who founded Social Alpha Foundation, which is a philanthropic crypto organization, the head of that, Jahan, he was a former art dealer at Sotheby's, and he had the idea that was seeing that the NFT art space was booming. And as soon as he mentioned this, it resonated a lot to me. In my free time, I do a lot of art, and so art is a big part of, I think, one ways that they connect. And I never thought about integrating art to our work, but it resonated. And so we reached out, and also thanks to him and Social Alpha Foundation, to some of the top NFT artists. This was back in January 2020. So in March 22nd, a month before Earth Day, we launched the Carbon Drop. We reached out to a couple of artists. Definitely the one that made the huge tabloid is Beeple. Beeple was such a supporter of this idea of, let's use art to fund public infrastructure for climate change that's focused on DLPs, just like distributed ledger technologies can revolutionize art, you can play a role in climate. So we suddenly found a
For,
great
for
audience.
for people who don't know Beeple, just to put it in context, like it was within a month of that time frame that Beeple sold an NFT for $69 million. One single NFT, right? So like this individual human artist was the top of the top when it came to name recognition in the NFT space at the time. And it still is today.
Yeah, absolutely, and such an influencer in the space. So I think it was in February where his piece sold for that, and then we were like right up after that. But other amazing artists that were part of that cohort, and they're for us our primary philanthropists. And we every time that we have a win as an organization and at the annual report, we reach out to all these artists and say, "You're the most important stakeholder that we've had from an individual standpoint." So in one weekend, we auctioned 8 pieces of digital art all around a climate theme, using Nifty Gateway as the portal, and raised $6.6 million, of which Beeple was 6 million, which all others also broke records. Rafiq Anadol, amazing artist, truly amazing artist, also had his first NFT art auction there. Fuck Render, G-Monk, so many great artists that are still some of the top NFT artists in the space, and that was a great, unprecedented way for us to start and to set ourselves up to be able to do our work, which is expensive, right? You know this well, full stacks, engineers, and having that on staff is not easy, but it's also what allows you to build, not just put out white papers. So that really helped us a lot, and we were so inspired by it that then we did another one, an ocean drop, at the end of that year, in the context of the Miami Art Basel, and that helped us raise not as much as the previous one, but enough to set up our ocean program. And so that's how we really got started, really, and help us do a big push on our open climate engineering efforts. We set a small endowment. There is exposure to the markets when you do that, so it's not like 2022 was great for us, but it also helps us focus on the fact that for the type of work that we do, we need institutional permanence. So we have to find a way to maintain the systems that we put out, because it doesn't work if you put out a great digital protocol, but you're off, you're bust, and then it's 2030 and no one knows how to maintain it. So that's a challenge, right? So how do we transition from that sort of like really one-off capital injection to going forward? I think because of what we've done so far, we've made a name to some of the philanthropic organizations that are often needing to support climate projects. Of course, we're a 501c3, so people can donate to us, but we realize that it's hard to get through the mainstream audience with our mission, and that's also why we're trying to think about how to explain what we do from the context of collaboration. But what we also find is the importance of creating like multi-stakeholder consortiums and collaboratives or coalitions that we can lead, so that it's not just us trying to fundraise, that other organizations that can implement things with us are also contributing to that, and where donors are not alone funding a single risky idea, that they can find peers, and so you can create co-funding collaboratives with co-implementation collaboratives. So we're in the process of writing a concept note and a whole organization of how to get these supranational organizations, World Bank, UN Climate, UNDP, UNEP, that need a lot of the digital infrastructure implementation and the capacity building. Because let's remember that this is great. We're talking about cool tech, but the global south, as we say it in the climate space, doesn't necessarily have the capability to deal with new technology. So you need to build tools to get them on board. So there's a lot of need for that. And so having supranationals in one level, having co-funders come together and support projects, look at a pipeline of saying, yeah, this is high leverage point, I can fund this, and then implementation partners, 501c3s like us, but also tech companies that can implement, right? and then think about those pre-competitive layers, right? So a common uh, reporting, routing protocol for greenhouse gas SaaS companies. They all need to be part of that. So we work closely with Linux. They're really good at doing the member-based coalitions. We're not a member-based organization. So that's one of the big things that we're exploring. The other one is, of course, large grants from tech firms or from other groups that are particularly in the space of climate tech, that want to look at multi-year projects. The other tier is EU Commission is really good at putting $20-30 million grants to consortiums. One of the areas that we want to be able to be better is to talk to major donors, individuals that had the ability to do powerful exits through their tech firms and care about climate and care about how tech plays a role in climate from a social issue and from a collaboration issue, how we can get more to them as well. And being a California organization, of course, that's a natural area for us to do better. So we're figuring out as we go in the adaptation. We could have come up with like a token at some point, and we've looked a lot at augmented bonding curves, like one example of how to fund digital public goods within the Web3 space. They're not quite there yet, or set up our DAO. I've spent a lot of time thinking about these things. I think eventually there's a lot of opportunities for that, but not quite there in a way that we feel super comfortable of saying this is great, right? So sometimes we fall back to traditional fundraising for nonprofits, and then open to ideas.
Well, on the notion of wild ideas, beyond the fundraising thing, what are some of the wild ideas that you all are working on right now in general?
Yeah, there's certain patterns that we see that keep, like, after decades being a deadlock. And in the climate space, the big one is the North-South divide. So the global South is always seen as poor. They don't have funding. Their currencies are indebted. And so they're asking the money from the North. The North says no, but you emit it most of the time. This is the nature of these negotiations and discussions in the climate space. And you realize, well, if we don't solve this, we have a problem. So that's one angle that I've noticed that we really need to innovate there. And the second one is we launched an ocean program to try to think about how do we help a government fund a marine protected area. Because when we think about, let's say, carbon credits, we think about land and forest, and those are very open for the private sector. You could buy a piece of forest somewhere, you can engage it in a red project and sell your carbon credits to Microsoft if you want to, and when they come alive, you can even do it as a natural asset company. But oceans are so much more complicated because this is economic exclusive areas. And through there, we started talking with the Costa Rican central bank, and they said, well, we've got central bank environmental accounts, and we don't really know what to do. And so one thing that we've just published to peers, and we'll be publishing more broadly in April, is the concept of nature-based currencies. The other inspiration of that has actually been the KlimaDAO. We were part of some of the early discussions of that, because KlimaDAO created a first sort of like digital native environmental derivative, something that this token is tied to, this digital treasury. And so I thought that was fascinating. And we are thinking about how does the Global South print the financial capital that they need for climate and conservation that's programmable towards those cost centers, backed by or based on the natural capital that they have. And there's a lot of nuances to that. On one side, you've got central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, and a lot of governments are rolling out ideas for CBDCs, some that leverage Web3, some that don't. But on the other side, you can't directly make nature a collateral that is backing an instrument, some like gold, right? So when gold used to back the US dollar, that means that you could technically exchange, like, there's enough gold there to back for your dollar. You can't do that. You can't be like, give me my tree for my dollar. And you also cannot do where under any default situation, I'll take your forest, right? Like, that doesn't work, and we'll just chop the lumber, sell it, and then we'll get the money back. So you have to do it in a way where what you value is the fact that the ecosystems that are backing the currency are valued because they're alive. And then the thought process is that if your natural capital or your living capital is healthy and vibrant and there's biodiversity, then you have a strong currency, and that currency is programmably designed to cover the cost of your park rangers and your surveillance and your enforcement and your MRV system and the restoration projects. But if you chop it down, as we've seen the last 4 years with Brazil, then your national currency would go down. How do we create that mechanism? And how do we do it in a way where the South is not sort of tied to monetary schemes in the North? The example on the North is the IMF, which is responsible for the SDRs, which are these special drawing rights, printed $980 billion of SDRs in the context of COVID to help. Out of those 980, 250 went to global South countries. So you kind of have a printing machine that benefits the rich countries. So like, well, if you're going to come up with any rules of how to do that, why does the South I'm from Argentina. Latin America has a great potential to come together around bioregions like the Amazon or the Galapagos underwater mountain ranges or the Andes and say, well, this is wealth, this is value, and we need the currency for that. This is our right. And maybe we can not only scale nature for debt swaps, but find a way of studying this. This is out there as an idea. It's wild, but we need to drive some of these thoughts because there's actually a lot of opportunity for digital infrastructure for that. If nature's the future gold, the way that you MRV the health of your nature becomes a very important thing, right? And this is delicate subjects because it's like, you're financializing nature fully. So we've immediately realized that like indigenous communities need to be part of this discussion and launched this initiative at COP with a lot of a coalition of indigenous nations. And we had in the audience the Bank of International Settlements and former central bankers. Having those discussions is important. And you'd be surprised, Cody. Governments are saying this is very exciting. This is an interesting idea, and central bankers are saying this makes sense. From there to seeing a first nature-based CBDC, as we put out in the first white paper, I think will be some time. But we want to be the ones also, at least one that stewards some of these thoughts.
I mean, Martin, what I'm loving from this whole conversation is I'm literally picturing these very formal rooms you're sitting in with central bankers and, this, that, and the other. And it's almost like you're pulling the hoods off the hackers, like in real time and, like helping people come together and collaborate together, leveraging, these very cutting edge new technologies to hopefully solve very important global collaboration problems. And that visual just sort of sits with me for some reason. Where do you need help for people who are listening, regardless of which of the various topics we've talked about, help with, how to continue to fund your operations, whether it's help with the idea of the accounting layers that you're building, or whether it's some of the, future ideas that you're thinking about, such as nature-backed currencies. Where do you need help today?
Thank you. Really, really appreciate that question, and I love your visual as well. I think the first way people can help is get informed. Go to OpenEarth.org, look at some of the programs. If there's feedback, give feedback. If you are a data engineer, if you're a coder, if you're a tech person, look at some of our open source projects. Go to our GitHub. OpenClimate is fully open. You can do pull requests. You can look at our Ocean program. We're publishing Python data pipelines for how to create marine ecosystem credits. So you can collaborate in that way. If you are you realize that this is an important thing to fund, hopefully there's a donate button. You can donate. If you are well endowed and you want to, really support projects, I'd love to reach out. I'd love to talk to you more about some of the things that we're doing and how you can support that. If you run an organization that works in the space and you see that there's opportunities to collaborate around common infrastructure, we'd love to hear from you. If you are great at marketing and communication and press, 501c3s like us need a lot of help. Get involved. We run a Climate Action Data 2.0 community that meets every month. Join our newsletter where we constantly put out channels through that channel, ways in which people can engage. We're hiring a tech lead for Openclimate. So if you're a full stack with a lot of experience and had a lot of experience with large organizations, and now you want to make a difference, you can apply. Often last year we did a lot of hiring. So the other way is get engaged and submit your CV. Right now we have that position. And yeah, I think that sort of covers like where people might come from and how everyone can collaborate in any way possible.
Martin, I'm so glad we finally got to do this. Thanks for coming on, sharing what you're building with OpenEarth Foundation, sharing more about your background and your motivations for doing it in the first place. And I can't wait to see what you all continue to innovate on as time progresses.
Thank you so much, Cody. An honor to be here and share this climate journey. And I know that everyone has so many great stories in this podcast. So I look forward to all the future ones and see more ways in which we can also collaborate with MCJ.